So the Renaissance in Europe came about around 1300 to 1500. First things to think about is that the reason for this is partially due to crusades, partially due to things like the Black Death. The Islamic Empire had been a place of learning, science, and the preservation of classical texts. They had the earliest university and scholars that actually worked on mathematics, sciences, so on and so forth. Um, the Crusades led Europeans to Byzantine or Roman and Arab learning and reacquainted them to the achievements of classical antiquity. This learning included medical knowledge, philosophy, mathematics, astronomy, and geography. Renaissance life is very similar to medieval life. Really, if you're poor or the streets, the cities didn't look all that different before and after the supposed Renaissance. The Renaissance is the 19th century, so 1800s ideal. It wasn't called that during the time period. Um, but truthfully, even in the Middle Ages, many different regions had learning in Europe, so it wasn't like all learning and knowledge was lost, in this dark age. It's always a mistaken idea for the most part, and new arts sprang up all over the place. So overall, the initial onset of Renaissance in Europe would have been in Italy, primarily in merchant republics that were more about making money than anything else, of course. In Italy, Venice, Genoa, Florence, and Pisa um, were the centers of learning and also merchant activity. So merchants began trade with Eastern Mediterranean ports from these cities, and this connected Europe to the Eastern world. China and India, for instance. These cities were not unified countries, but individual city-states developed into secular republics connected to banking and merchant activities. Some of the famous explorers come from Italy, and it's no surprise that these people come from these merchant republics, because this is where sailors would be needed. So Christopher Columbus, John Cabot, they're all people from these places. Um, the Italian merchant elite funded the arts, innovation, philosophers, and explorations. They celebrated civic humanism, which is an ideology that praised public virtue in service to the state. And these profoundly influenced the American Republic, of course. Uh, Artists such as Michelangelo, Leonardo da Vinci, Jacopo Bellini, Raphael, Filippo Brunelleschi produced some of our greatest art and architecture. And also in the philosophy side, in 1513, Niccolo Machiavelli from Florence actually published The Prince, which told rulers how to gain more power, essentially. And most rulers read this thing. And to be honest, this is one of the early books that's also written in a vernacular language, not written in Latin. It was actually written in Italian, so people that could read their own language could read this book, actually. Um, Western European monarchs created royal law courts and bureaucracies to reduce the power of the nobility and forge alliances with local merchants and urban artists during this time. This is much some of the ideas taken from Machiavelli, actually. Um, so far as these groups, the local merchants and urban artists, they forge alliances through granting them privileges. When I say they, I'm talking about monarchs. To these groups, they allow these groups to create guilds. There's actually a flesher guild, which is like a butcher sign on the bottom right of the screen. Um, Anyhow, guilds basically controlled their trade in any given town or city. They controlled who could trade there, who could get into the business, and that sort of thing. More or less, it's a safeguard for locals, kind of protectionist policy against foreign trade. During the reign of Prince Henry, also known as Henry the Navigator, he reigned 1374 to 1460. Portugal began to fund maritime explorations. He founded an exploration sort of think tank almost, where explorers learned how to use the newest tools. The astrolabe came out of the Islamic Empire, for instance, and this was modified to work better for travel south to the southern hemisphere. Um, Anyhow, during one of the crusades that Henry was on, he learned of Arab merchants who made riches in slaves and gold, trading across the Sahara Desert, and he sought out this similar practice. He wished to find a route to Western Africa to take advantage of this trade, and so his center for navigation was called the Center for Oceanic Navigation and Astronomical Observation. To achieve the task of navigating around Cape Bojador in North Africa into the Sea of Darkness. There's a point, if you're traveling south, you lose sight of the North Star, and at this point you have no idea how to get home, so they had to figure out a way to navigate till to find a way back beyond this point. And actually, even in very ancient times, there's mentions of being unable to sail past this point, so long history for Europe not being able to get past it. The Portuguese were the first Europeans to set up colonies and trading posts on Madeira and the Azore Islands, and the west coast of Africa for that matter, to take advantage of the African slave trade and ivory trade. And as a matter of fact, by shortly after this point, Lisbon will have over 10,000 slaves, black slaves, in the city. So they really are the founders of the Columbian exchange in terms of slaves being a commodity traded on that market. So West African slavery, this shows the area which is considered West Africa and where Portugal had connected to set up markets. In the 1400s, tropical rainforest covered much of the coast, but many large rivers such as the Senegal, Gambia, Volta, Niger, and Congo rivers allowed access to interior woodland and savanna regions, where many people lived, actually. Make no mistake, Africa is not like an empty continent with nothing there. There are civilizations and kingdoms, and stuff is there, so it's kind of a colonial sort of BS thing that nothing was there. Kind of like the Americas concept, really. The seacoast was mostly vacant of cities or towns. Western Africans lived in villages and did agricultural work. Men cleared fields and women planted and harvested crops. Millet and cotton were the most common crops in this region. And these people domesticated livestock as well. So more interior and towards like forest regions, there's forest peoples actually planted yams, which are like sweet potatoes, and harvested palm nuts, which produced palm oil. They traded palm oil and cola nuts as well, which were a stimulant for textiles and leather goods from the Savannah peoples. The Savannah people also collected salt and mined for ore deposits, and they traded also with the coastal peoples for manufactured objects in iron and gold. Some of these different regions actually contained city-states with kings and princes. There was many languages spoken. Some of their villages were chiefdoms or smaller political organizations, but many spiritual beliefs also persisted in this area, including something called animism, which is sort of an ancient form of religion. The idea that there's a sort of life force that flows through all things, living and not living. I'm not talking about Star Wars here. It's actually something that people believed in. And this animism has syncretized into Islam in this region, and also we see it in Buddhism and other major religions today, typically shamanistic in nature. So Islam was also spread to this region long ago, but it has very unique local sort of ideals, which included many spirits, entities, and some people might say demons or something, but jinn is one of them. But anyhow, it looks very different than traditional Islam. Early Europeans seem to have positive impact on these societies by introducing new plants and animals, such as the Portuguese, who brought lemons, oranges, pigs, and coconuts. And this actually was positive for this region. So for a time at least, Europeans had a positive effect to some extent, at least for some peoples, not if you were taken as a slave, obviously. After 1492, Europeans brought African maize, tomatoes, and manioc, which all come from the Americas, to these regions. And overall, the Africans were semi-safe from Europeans because Europeans could not travel up more than 150 miles up the rivers with their ships. But also, Europeans often got malaria and yellow fever and would die from it. So it's not a risk you wanted to take. So they're kind of dependent on the interior peoples to bring products closer to the coasts. By the 1500s, Chinese and Indian products were being brought into this region as well. So they saw an increase of products. Of course, Portugal began getting involved in the slave trade that the Arabs and African states had been conducting for some time now. In Africa, people could be put to slavery from debts. Sometimes kin sold them, so you might sell your children or sell someone in your family. Then others were captured in war. They served as agricultural workers and in slave armies, typically treated as property. Soni Ali, ruler from 1464 to 1492 of the Kingdom of Songhay, which is the Islamic kingdom, owned at least 12 tribes of slaves under a system of hereditary slavery where everyone connected to a slave also became a slave. Everyone born into their family would also be a slave. So this should be somewhat familiar in terms of system when we talk about slavery in America. In this world, slavery was everywhere in large numbers. Islamic explorer Ibn Battuta wrote of traveling with a caravan of 600 female slaves in 1350, so it's been a while. People have been doing this sort of practice. The Portuguese established coastal forts to purchase slaves for shipment to other regions. The first in 1482, they brought the slaves from Africa. They bought the slaves from African princes and warlords. It started with sugar plantations at Cape Verde and their Atlantic island colonies. Lisbon also became a slave port. As I've mentioned, over 10,000 slaves resided in Lisbon before 1492 even. So in 1492, King Ferdinand of Aragon and Queen Isabel of Castile had an arranged marriage to unite their kingdoms into a single national unit in order to expel the Muslims from Iberia and for commerce purposes. So they completed the Reconquista in 1492. This was part attacking Granada, the last stronghold of Muslims. Once they captured this, Spain was sort of complete. They reconquered the whole territory of Iberia. And then they were unified through the symbol and ideology of Catholicness. In order to build upon and expand, so build empire and expand trade, the monarchs hired explorers to gain access to India and China more directly. Because in 1453, and already the Ottoman Turks already had an empire that essentially blocked most of Europe from the east. But when they captured Constantinople, this is the last vestige of a European place to conduct trade with. They could do trade through the Ottoman Empire, but it would cost a lot more and make things less cost effective. So Vasco da Gama did make a route to India from Iberia, actually from Portugal really. This is for the benefit of Portugal, so obviously they need someone on their side. So they hired Christopher Columbus, who believed that there was a very narrow water passage heading to India and China, heading west. So he believed in 2,000 to 3,000 miles he'd run into China. The Arabs had believed that, and they had charts that showed that it was a 10,000 mile sea. He said they were wrong. The monarchs did not trust this Genovese merchant sailor, but backed him anyway because he made bold claims. Columbus set sail with 3 small ships in August 1492, and 6 weeks later he traveled 3,000 miles and landed on some islands, which were present-day Bahamas. The biggest deal to Columbus would be that he opened the gateways to European expansion. Of course, he created the name Indians as well. So in conclusion, Western Europe was an agricultural world made up of mostly poor peasants that want to come up in the world. Crusades brought back old knowledge. Turkish tolls prompted Europeans to find new trade routes. And exploration and conquest of the Americas was rooted in commerce primarily. Europeans were not particularly enlightened or advanced comparatively, but They did have some technological advantages still. We'll talk about that more next